The photograph should have been destroyed. When restoration experts examined the 1888 Dunham family portrait with magnifying equipment decades later, what they discovered beneath layers of aged emulsion would haunt them forever. Something impossible was wrapped around Henry Dunham's throat, something that shouldn't exist in any world governed by natural law. The 27-year-old's death certificate had always puzzled historians, listing strangulation as the cause of death, despite no evidence of foul play. But the truth hiding in plain sight within that innocent family portrait would prove far more terrifying than any crime of passion could ever be. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn of 1888 arrived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with an unusual chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the earth. The Dunham family had prospered in the coal mining business, their fortune built on the backs of immigrant workers who descended daily into the black depths beneath their feet. Henry Dunham, at 27, had inherited not just his father's business acumen, but also something far more sinister that had passed down through generations of his bloodline like a family curse wrapped in jewel. Respectability. The photography studio of Marcus Whitfield occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on Main Street, its large windows facing north to capture the steady, shadowless light that portrait photographers prized. Above all else, Whitfield had arrived in Millbrook 3 months earlier, carrying with him an expensive camera imported from Germany and a mysterious past that he kept locked away as securely as his photographic plates. The townspeople whispered about the young man's pale complexion and the way his eyes seemed to see things that others couldn't, but his skill with the camera was undeniable. When Henry Dunham climbed the creaking wooden stairs to Whitfield's studio that crisp October morning, he brought with him his 2 younger brothers, James and William. The family portrait had been their mother's dying wish, spoken with her final breath 6 months earlier as she lay wasting away from consumption in the grand 4-poster bed that had witnessed 3 generations of Dunham births and deaths. Margaret Dunham's last words had been a warning disguised as a request, though none of her sons understood the true meaning behind her fevered whispers about keeping the family together, about never letting the darkness take hold. James, 24 years old with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who wasn't afraid of honest labor, stood nearly as tall as his eldest brother, but possessed a gentleness that Henry had never known. Where Henry's eyes held the calculating coldness of a born predator, James carried their mother's compassion and their grandfather's simple faith in the goodness of ordinary people. He had wanted to become a teacher before their father's death forced him into the family business, and sometimes late at night he still read poetry by candlelight, dreaming of the life he might have lived in a world where duty didn't bind him to the coal dust and the endless pursuit of profit. William, the youngest at 21, remained caught between his brothers, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain whether to step forward into darkness or retreat into the safety of ignorance. His mind was sharp enough to recognize the wrongness that seemed to follow Henry like a shadow, but his heart was too loyal to acknowledge what his instincts screamed at him to accept. William had always been the family peacemaker, the one who smoothed over Henry's harsh business dealings with apologetic smiles and carefully worded explanations that made cruelty sound like necessity. The studio itself was a study in organized chaos, with photographic equipment scattered across tables that groaned under the weight of glass plates, chemical baths, and the accumulated detritus of artistic ambition. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the harsh Pennsylvania sunlight, creating an artificial twilight that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of developing chemicals, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. Whitfield emerged from behind his camera, like a specter materializing from the darkness, his movements precise and economical as he arranged his subjects according to some internal vision that none of them could share. He positioned Henry in the center, his hand resting on James's shoulder in a gesture that appeared protective but felt somehow possessive. William stood slightly apart, his body language suggesting a subconscious desire to flee from whatever invisible presence seemed to fill the room with its malevolent attention. "The light is perfect today," Whitfield murmured, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that none of the brothers could place. "The shadows will capture everything, every detail that makes you who you are. His pale fingers adjusted the camera's focus with practiced ease, but there was something in his manner that suggested he was seeing far more than just three well-dressed young men posed for a family portrait. Henry's suit was cut from the finest wool that money could buy, its deep charcoal color complementing his severe features and the premature gray that had begun to thread through his dark hair. A gold pocket watch chain stretched across his vest, its weight a constant reminder of the empire he had built from his father's modest beginnings. But it was his collar that would later capture the attention of those examining the photograph. The way the starched white fabric seemed to strain against something that pressed against his throat from within, creating subtle shadows that shouldn't have existed in the even light of the studio. The brothers maintained their poses as Whitfield disappeared beneath the dark cloth that draped his camera, his muffled voice counting down the seconds of exposure time. During those long moments of enforced stillness, Henry felt the familiar sensation of fingers that weren't quite his own, exploring the edges of his consciousness, pressing against the barriers he had spent years learning to construct. The presence that had first made itself known during his 14th year had grown stronger with each passing season, feeding on the power and wealth he accumulated, demanding payment in forms that decent men couldn't contemplate. James shifted slightly, his natural restlessness making it difficult to maintain the rigid pose that portrait photography required. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in one of the studio's many mirrors and was startled by what he saw, not in his own face, but in Henry's. For just an instant, his brother's features seemed to blur and shift, as if something else was looking out through his eyes, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting centuries for the right vessel to carry it into the modern world. "Hold still," Whitfield called from beneath his cloth, but his voice seemed to come from farther away than the camera's position, as if distance itself had been stretched and distorted within the confines of the studio. "The shadows are moving, and we must capture them before they decide to reveal themselves completely." William felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill that seeped through the studio's thin walls. The sensation of being watched by invisible eyes had grown stronger since they arrived, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph would capture far more than their mother had intended. Family portraits were supposed to preserve memories of love and connection, but what was happening in this room felt more like a summoning, as if they were calling something forth from the spaces between light and darkness. The exposure lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity during which the brothers were forced to remain absolutely motionless, while Whitfield worked his mysterious craft behind the camera. Henry used the time to practice the meditation techniques he had learned from books that most men would have burned rather than read, focusing his will on maintaining control over the entity that shared his flesh. The thing that looped within him had been growing stronger lately, more demanding in its appetites, more willing to exert its influence over his thoughts and actions. When Whitfield finally emerged from beneath his cloth, his face was even paler than usual, and his hands trembled slightly as he began the process of developing the photographic plate. "The image will be ready for viewing in approximately 1 hour," he announced, but his voice carried an odd note of uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely sure what the chemicals would reveal when they stripped away the layers of silver and gelatin that held the light captive. The brothers retreated to a nearby tavern to wait, settling into a corner booth where the shadows gathered thick enough to provide privacy for conversations that couldn't be overheard by curious ears. Henry ordered whiskey neat, a drink that matched his personality in its harsh simplicity, while James and William contented themselves with beer that tasted of hops and the distant promise of better times. The alcohol did little to ease the tension that had settled over them like a heavy blanket, that he provided a familiar ritual that helped anchor them to the ordinary world of commerce and conversation. "Mother would have been pleased," James ventured, though his words carried less conviction than comfort. "She always said the family should stay together, that we were stronger when we stood as one." He didn't mention the other things their mother had said during her final delirium, the warnings about darkness that ran in their bloodline like a poison that could be diluted but never completely purged. Henry's response was a non-committal grunt that discouraged further discussion of their mother's last wishes. He had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when every day brought fresh challenges that required the kind of ruthless decision-making that had built their fortune from the foundation of other Bella. Men's suffering. The coal mines that funded their comfortable lives were filled with the bones of workers who had died for the privilege of making the Dunham family rich. And Henry felt no more guilt about their sacrifice than a farmer felt about the wheat he harvested. William studied his eldest brother's profile, noting the way Henry's jaw tightened whenever their conversation touched on matters of family obligation or moral responsibility. There had always been something different about Henry, something that set him apart from other men, even before their father's death had thrust him into a position of absolute authority over the family business. As children, William had noticed how animals seemed to avoid Henry's touch, how dogs would growl and cats would hiss when he entered a room, as if they could sense something in him that human perception couldn't detect. The hour passed slowly, filled with stilted conversation, and the kind of uncomfortable silence that develops between men who share blood but not understanding. When they finally returned to Whitfield's studio, they found the photographer standing before a large easel, where the finished portrait rested, still damp from its chemical bath. His face was ashen, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "I've been developing photographs for 15 years, Whitfield began, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I've never encountered anything like this. The image is technically perfect, every detail rendered with absolute clarity, but there are elements present that shouldn't exist." He gestured toward the photograph with a hand that shook visibly, drawing their attention to details that hadn't been visible during the actual sitting. The portrait showed the three brothers exactly as they had posed, Henry's hand resting protectively on his sibling's shoulders, their expressions serious but not unpleasant. The lighting was indeed perfect, capturing the texture of their clothing and the individual characteristics that made each face unique. But there, emerging from within Henry's collar, were fingers that belonged to no living hand, thin and pale and impossibly long, curling around his throat with a grip that suggested both possession and strangulation. James stepped closer to the photograph, his breath catching in his throat as he noticed other details that defied rational explanation. The shadows behind Henry seemed deeper than those surrounding his brothers, as if light itself was being drawn into some invisible vortex that existed just beyond the frame. His eyes, which had appeared normal during the sitting, now held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the surface of the deck. Photographic plate, creating the unsettling impression that something was looking back at anyone who dared to meet his gaze. "This is impossible," William breathed, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. The evidence was literally before his eyes, captured with a precision that no human artist could have achieved. The photograph revealed truths that the naked eye had been unable to perceive, truths about the nature of his brother that William had suspected but never dared to confront. Henry remained silent as he studied his own image, his expression unreadable as he took in the details that proclaimed his true nature to anyone with the courage to see. The fingers wrapped around his throat were both foreign and familiar, belonging to the entity that had been his constant companion for more than half his life. In the harsh honesty of the photograph, the symbiotic relationship between man and monster was laid bare, revealing the price he had paid for the power that had elevated his family above their humble origins. Whitfield backed away from the easel, as if the photograph itself posed a physical threat, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of what he had inadvertently documented. "I don't know what you are," he said, addressing Henry directly, "but I want no part of whatever darkness follows you. Take the photograph and leave, and never return to my studio." His words carried the authority of a man who had encountered the supernatural before and learned the wisdom of avoiding entanglements with forces beyond human comprehension. The transaction was completed in tense silence, money changing hands with the efficiency of men who wanted nothing more than to be away from each other's presence. Henry wrapped the photograph carefully in brown paper, handling it with the reverence one might show to a religious relic or a particularly dangerous weapon. The image represented both validation and vulnerability, proof of his true nature that could be used against him by anyone with sufficient knowledge of the old ways. As the brothers descended the stairs from Whitfield's studio, the autumn air seemed to carry whispers of conversations that hadn't yet taken place, promises of consequences that would unfold like ripples spreading across the bow. Surface of a dark pond. The photograph tucked under Henry's arm felt heavier than its physical weight could account for, as if it had absorbed some essential part of their souls during the exposure process. The walk back to their family mansion took them through the heart of Millbrook, past the shops and businesses that depended on Dunham money for their continued existence. Henry noticed how people stepped aside to let them pass, their deference born not just from respect for wealth, but from an instinctive recognition of something predatory that walked among them wearing the mask of valor. Respectability. The town that had nurtured their family for 3 generations had become, in some fundamental way, their hunting ground. James and William flanked their brother like reluctant bodyguards, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed in the photographer's studio. The evidence of Henry's otherworldly alliance couldn't be denied, but accepting it meant confronting questions about their own complicity in whatever dark bargain had elevated their family's fortunes. How many of the decisions they had attributed to Henry's business acumen were actually the influence of something inhuman that spoke through his voice and acted through his hands? The Dunham mansion stood at the end of Elm Street like a monument to prosperity, built on foundations that few cared to examine too closely. 3 stories of red brick and white trim rose from manicured grounds that were maintained by gardeners who never quite met Henry's eyes when they spoke to him. The house had been in the family for 2 generations, but under Henry's ownership, it had acquired an atmosphere of subtle menace that visitors found difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Inside the mansion's oak-paneled walls, family portraits dating back 5 generations gazed down from their gilded frames with expressions that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Henry had always claimed that strong bloodlines produce strong leaders, but looking at those ancestral faces now, William Everall wondered if strength was the right word for what had been passed down through their family tree like a carefully guarded secret. Henry carried the wrapped photograph up to his private study, a room that occupied the mansion's entire 3rd floor and was accessible only through a single locked door. The brothers had been forbidden to enter this sanctum since their father's death, and the few servants who were permitted inside emerged with haunted expressions that discouraged questions about what they had witnessed. It was here that Henry conducted the business that couldn't be discussed in more public venues, negotiations that required privacy and discretion that went beyond normal commercial concerns. The study's windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out all natural light, creating an environment where time seemed suspended and the normal rules of cause and effect held less sway than they did in the world and eye. Beyond, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with books that bore titles in languages that predated Christianity and dealt with subjects that universities refused to acknowledge as legitimate fields of study. At the room's center stood a massive oak desk that had belonged to their great-grandfather, its surface scarred by rituals that left marks that went deeper than wood. Henry unwrapped the photograph with the careful attention of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, positioning it on the desk where lamplight would illuminate every disturbing detail. The image seemed to have gained even more clarity during their journey home, as if distance from the photographer's studio had allowed its true nature to manifest more completely. The fingers wrapped around his throat were now clearly visible to anyone who looked closely, their inhuman length and unnatural pallor leaving no doubt about their otherworldly origin. For nearly an hour, Henry studied the photograph in silence, his expressions cycling through emotions that ranged from satisfaction to concern to something approaching fear. The entity that shared his flesh had been captured in the act of asserting its dominance, its presence made manifest through Whitfield's unknowing artistry. The photograph was simultaneously a triumph and a liability, proof of the power he wielded and evidence that could be used to destroy him if it fell into the wrong hands. Meanwhile, James and William waited in the mansion's parlor, like condemned men awaiting their sentence, neither willing to voice the questions that burned in their minds, but unable to pretend that life could simply continue as it had before. The photograph had shattered their carefully constructed illusions about their brother and their family, forcing them to confront truths that decent people weren't supposed to know. The wealth that had provided their comfortable lives suddenly felt tainted, built on foundations that were far more sinister than simple capitalist exploitation. James poured himself a brandy from the crystal decanter that had belonged to their grandfather, hoping that alcohol might blur the sharp edges of what he had witnessed. The taste was smooth and expensive, carrying notes of oak and thyme that spoke of patience and careful craftsmanship, but it did nothing to wash away the memory of those impossible fingers wrapped around his brother's throat. He found himself wondering how long Henry had been host to whatever entity had claimed him, whether the brother he thought he knew had ever really existed at all. William stood at the parlor's tall windows, staring out at the grounds where their mother's rose garden was preparing for winter's sleep. Margaret Dunham had loved those roses with a passion that transcended mere gardening, tending them with her own hands even when their family's wealth could have afforded a dozen professional gardeners. Now William wondered if her devotion to the flowers had been motivated by more than aesthetic pleasure, if she had seen them as symbols of beauty and innocence that needed protection from the darkness that was growing within her own family. The sun was setting by the time Henry emerged from his study, his expression composed but somehow different, as if the time spent alone with the photograph had changed him in ways that went beyond the merely psychological. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a man of his size and disposition, and his eyes held depths that reflected light and patterns that hurt to look at directly. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated at frequencies just below the threshold of human hearing. "We need to discuss the implications of what happened today," Henry announced, settling into the leather armchair that had been their father's favorite spot for contemplation. "The photograph has revealed certain truths that can no longer remain unspoken, and decisions must be made about how we proceed as a family." His words were carefully chosen, diplomatic in their phrasing but carrying undercurrents of threat that neither brother could ignore. James set down his brandy glass with hands that trembled slightly, the crystal singing a pure note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. "What are you, Henry?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What have you become, and what does it mean for the rest of us?" The questions had been building inside him since they left Whitfield's studio, demanding release despite his fear of the answers they might provoke. Henry's smile was thin and cold, devoid of any warmth that might have softened the predatory intelligence that gleamed in his eyes. "I am what our family has always been, James, simply more honest about it than our ancestors chose to be. The entity that shares my flesh has been part of our bloodline for 7 generations, passed down from father to son like any other inheritance. Our wealth, our success, our power over others, all of it comes from the bargain that was struck long before we were born." End quote. William turned from the window to face his brother directly, his features pale but determined. "Mother knew, didn't she? That's why she was so insistent about the family portrait, why she wanted us all together one last time. She was trying to warn us about you, trying to give us some record of what you had become." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, making him understand that their mother's final months had been spent in the knowledge that she was leaving her younger sons in the care of something that was no longer entirely human. "Mother was weak," Henry replied with a casual cruelty that made both brothers flinch. "She lacked the strength to embrace what we truly are, preferring the comfortable lies that allow ordinary people to sleep peacefully in their beds. But weakness is a luxury that successful men cannot afford. And I have ensured that our family will never again know the poverty and powerlessness that plagued our great-grandfather's generation." End quote. The conversation continued deep into the night, with Henry revealing truths about their family history that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about their heritage. The coal mines that provided their wealth had been acquired through methods that went far beyond shrewd business practices, involving negotiations with entities that existed in the spaces between light and shadow. Workers who had died in cave-ins had been sacrifices rather than accidents, their life force feeding the entity that had elevated the Dunham family above their humble origins. James listened with growing horror as his brother described the systematic corruption of their family's legacy, the way each generation had been drawn deeper into bargains that promised power at prices that could never be fully calculated. The entity that possessed Henry fed on human suffering, growing stronger with each act of cruelty and exploitation that was committed in its name. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape poverty had evolved into something far more sinister, a partnership between man and monster that had lasted for over a century. William found himself thinking about the workers in their mines, men with families who depended on Dunham wages to survive, but who faced dangers that went beyond the natural hazards of their profession. How many of those deaths had been genuine accidents, and how many had been offerings to whatever dark power had claimed their brother's soul? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through his understanding of their family business, until every aspect of their success seemed tainted by inhuman influence. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Henry finally revealed the true purpose of their conversation. The photograph had captured evidence of his true nature, but it had also served as a form of contract, binding his brothers to the family legacy in ways that went beyond blood relation. Simply by witnessing the manifestation of the entity's power, James and William had become complicit in its continued existence, their silence purchased through a combination of shared guilt and fear of exposure. "You have two choices," Henry explained, with the detached manner of a man discussing a routine business transaction. "You can accept what we are and take your place as willing participants in our family's true calling. Or you can resist and discover firsthand why the entity has never allowed anyone to betray its confidence. Either way, you will serve our purposes, though one path offers considerably more comfort than the other." James felt something break inside his chest, a sound like glass shattering in a distant room. The brother he had loved and respected for 24 years was gone, replaced by something that wore Henry's face but served inhuman masters. The choice being offered wasn't really a choice at all, but rather an ultimatum delivered with the cold efficiency that Henry brought to all his business dealings. Resist and die, or surrender and become complicit in whatever horrors were necessary to maintain their family's position. William closed his eyes and tried to imagine their mother's voice, seeking some guidance from beyond the grave that might help him navigate the impossible situation in which they found themselves. But Margaret Dunham's spirit offered no comfort, only the echo of warnings that had come too late to prevent the trap from closing around them. The family portrait she had requested was meant to preserve the memory of her sons, as they had been before darkness claimed them completely, but instead it had become the instrument of their final corruption. The weeks that followed Henry's revelation passed like a fever dream, with reality becoming increasingly negotiable as the brothers adapted to their new understanding of their family's true nature. James tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy by focusing on the mind's daily operations, but even routine business decisions now carried implications that extended far beyond profit margins and, quote, worker safety. Every choice seemed to serve the entity's appetite in some way, feeding its hunger for human suffering while strengthening its hold over the Dunham legacy. William threw himself into research, spending long hours in the mansion's library reading books that their father had collected but never discussed. The volumes dealt with subjects that respectable men weren't supposed to acknowledge, exploring the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds with academic rigor that made their contents even more disturbing. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears about their family's history while revealing new horrors that their ancestors had carefully hidden from outside scrutiny. The entity that possessed Henry was ancient beyond human comprehension, a being that had existed long before the first humans learned to harness fire or cultivate crops. It fed on negative emotions and human suffering, growing stronger with each act of cruelty or exploitation that was committed in its name. Throughout history, it had formed partnerships with ambitious men who were willing to sacrifice their humanity in exchange for worldly success. But the Dunham family represented its longest and most successful boss: collaboration. As autumn deepened into winter, Henry's transformation became increasingly apparent to anyone with the courage to look closely. His movements acquired an inhuman fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated at frequencies that made listeners feel vaguely nauseous. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, which now held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the limits of human perception, creating the unsettling impression that something vast and alien was looking out through his pupils. The photograph remained in Henry's study, a constant reminder of the bargain that bound the brothers to their family's dark legacy. Whitfield had left Millbrook shortly after their session, departing so suddenly that he left behind most of his equipment and personal belongings. Local gossip suggested that he had received some kind of threat or warning, but William suspected that the photographer had simply recognized the danger of remaining in close proximity to whatever entity had revealed itself through his camera's lens. James began experiencing nightmares that felt more like memories, visions of events that had supposedly occurred before his birth, but which he could recall with vivid clarity. He saw their great-grandfather making the initial bargain that had cursed their bloodline, a desperate man trading his soul and those of his descendants for the power to escape grinding poverty. The entity had appeared to him in the form of shadows that moved independently of their sources, offering wealth and influence in exchange for services that could never be discussed in polite society. The coal mines that formed the foundation of their fortune had been built on ground that was sacred to the entity, locations where the barrier between worlds grew thin enough to allow communication with beings that existed beyond normal space and time. Each shaft that was sunk deeper into the earth brought the workers closer to realms where human understanding held no sway, and the accidents that claimed their lives were actually encounters with forces that their minds couldn't process without shattering completely. Winter brought its own revelations as Henry's behavior became increasingly erratic and demanding. He began requiring James and William to participate in rituals that took place in the mansion's basement, ceremonies that involved elements borrowed from traditions that predated Christianity by thousands of years. The brothers were forced to witness acts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality, while binding them ever more tightly to the entity's service through shared complicity. The basement itself had been modified during Henry's tenure as head of the family, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to move when viewed peripherally. The room's center was dominated by an altar that had been fashioned from a single block of black stone, its surface worn smooth by generations of use for purposes that decent people weren't supposed to contemplate. Around the altar's base, channels had been carved to direct the flow of liquids that were best left unidentified, and the air itself seemed thick with the accumulated weight of centuries of dark rituals. During these ceremonies, Henry would undergo transformations that revealed the true extent of his corruption, his human features blurring and shifting as the entity asserted more direct control over his physical form. His voice would deepen and take on multiple tones simultaneously, speaking in languages that had never been written down, but which somehow conveyed meaning to anyone who heard them. Most disturbing of all, additional limbs would manifest from his torso, pale and unnaturally long appendages that moved with purposes that had nothing to do with human anatomy. James found himself changing in response to prolonged exposure to these rituals, his perception expanding in ways that allowed him to see aspects of reality that normal human consciousness was designed to filter out. The world became a layered place where multiple dimensions pressed against each other, separated only by barriers as thin as soap bubbles and far more fragile. He began to understand that the entity possessing Henry was just one of countless beings that existed in the spaces between worlds, all of them seeking ways to influence events in the realm of matter and energy that humans craft, called reality. William's research revealed that their family's situation was far from unique, that throughout history there had been bloodlines that had formed similar partnerships with entities from beyond the veil. These families had served as anchors for their otherworldly allies, providing stable points of contact that allowed beings of pure thought and malice to exert influence over the physical world. In exchange, the human partners received power, wealth, and influence that elevated them far above their natural station, but always at costs that grew more demanding with each passing generation. The photograph that had started their descent into this nightmare remained a source of fascination and horror, its impossible details becoming more apparent with each viewing. Modern restoration techniques would eventually reveal layers of meaning that 1888 technology couldn't capture, showing not just the entity's physical manifestation, but also glimpses of the otherworldly craft, realm from which it originated. The image served as both evidence and gateway, a window into dimensions where the normal rules of existence held no authority. Spring arrived in Millbrook with unusual warmth, as if the earth itself was eager to escape the long months of winter that had seemed to last forever. But the change in weather brought no relief to the Dunham brothers, who had been irrevocably changed by their exposure to truths that human minds weren't designed to contain. Henry had grown stronger throughout the dark months, his partnership with the entity reaching new levels of integration that blurred the line between host and parasite until it became impossible to determine where one bray ended and the other began. The coal mines that supported their wealth had become even more dangerous for the workers. with accidents increasing in both frequency and severity as the entity's appetite grew more demanding. Men would disappear in cave-ins that left no recoverable remains, their life force consumed so completely that even their bones were reduced to dust that mingled with the coal they had died extracting. The surviving workers spoke in whispers about shadows that moved independently of their sources and voices that called from the deeper shafts. But economic necessity kept them returning to jobs that grew more perilous with Croc. Each passing day, James had begun to manifest abilities that suggested his own corruption was progressing more rapidly than he wanted to acknowledge. He could sense the emotional states of people around him with uncomfortable accuracy, feeling their fears and desires as if they were his own thoughts. More disturbing still, he found that he could influence those emotions through focused concentration, pushing individuals toward actions that served his family's interests while making them believe the decisions were entirely their own. William's scholarly research had uncovered references to other families that had formed similar partnerships with otherworldly entities, but in every case, the ultimate outcome had been the same. The human bloodlines eventually became so corrupted that they lost all capacity for independent thought, serving as nothing more than vessels for their inhuman allies to use in whatever manner seemed most advantageous. The process typically took 7 to 10 generations to reach completion, which meant that the Dunham family was approaching the final stages of their transformation. The realization that they were witnessing the end of their humanity rather than its enhancement came as a devastating blow to both brothers. Everything they had been taught about their family's success, all the pride they had taken in their ancestors' achievements, was revealed to be nothing more than the slow-motion collapse of their bloodline's capacity for moral choice. They were not the inheritors of a great legacy, but rather the final witnesses to its complete corruption. As summer arrived with oppressive heat that seemed to emanate from sources other than the sun, Henry announced that the time had come for his brothers to make their final choice. The entity had grown strong enough to begin manifesting independently of human hosts, but it still required willing vessels to serve as anchors in the physical realm. James and William could embrace their transformation willingly and retain some vestige of their individual consciousness, or they could resist and be consumed entirely, their bodies serving as empty shells for whatever purposes the entity deemed appropriate. The ultimatum was delivered in the mansion's parlor, the same room where they had waited in ignorance while Henry studied the photograph that had revealed the truth about their family's nature. Now that same space felt charged with otherworldly energy, the very air seeming to pulse with rhythms that had nothing to do with normal atmospheric pressure. Family portraits that had watched over generations of Dunhams now seemed to track their movements with eyes that held intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. James looked at his reflection in the parlor's tall mirror and was horrified to discover that his features were already beginning to change. Subtle alterations to his bone structure that made his face appear somehow inhuman, despite retaining all its familiar elements. His eyes had acquired depth similar to Henry's, creating the unsettling impression that something was looking out through his pupils, something that had never been human and never intended to become so. William felt the weight of 7 generations of family history pressing down on his shoulders, like a physical burden that grew heavier with each breath he took. The choices made by ancestors he had never met had led inexorably to this moment, trapping him in a web of obligation and consequences that offered no escape. He understood now why their mother had been so insistent about the family portrait, why she had wanted one final image of her sons before they were lost forever to the darkness that ran in their bloodline like a hereditary disease. The photograph itself had somehow migrated from Henry's study to the parlor's mantelpiece, its impossible details now clearly visible to anyone who looked closely. The fingers wrapped around Henry's throat seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the shadows behind his figure had deepened to the point where they appeared to extend infinitely into dimensions that human geometry couldn't, quote, describe. Most disturbing of all, new details had appeared since the image was first developed, as if the photograph was continuing to capture events that were occurring in real time, rather than preserving a moment from the past. Henry's transformation had reached the point where his human identity was little more than a convenient disguise, a familiar face that allowed him to move through normal society without attracting unwanted attention. When he spoke now, multiple voices seemed to emerge from his throat simultaneously, each carrying different emotional tones and speaking in languages that had never been heard by human ears. His movements had become completely fluid, suggesting that his skeleton had been replaced by something far more flexible and infinitely more alien. The entity that possessed him had begun to manifest physically, even when he was supposedly at rest, pale appendages emerging from his clothing at unexpected moments before withdrawing into whatever dimensional space they normally occupied. His collar, which had seemed merely tight in the original photograph, now clearly struggled to contain something that was trying to emerge from within his throat, creating bulges and distortions that moved independently of his breathing. As the summer heat intensified, bringing with it an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against the windows of the mansion like an invisible weight, James made his decision with the quiet resignation of a man who had run out of alternatives. He would accept the transformation willingly, hoping to retain enough of his individual consciousness to perhaps find some way to break the cycle that had claimed his family for 7 generations. The choice was made not from ambition or greed, but from a desperate hope that surrender might somehow lead to redemption. William's choice came harder, his scholarly nature demanding that he exhaust every possible alternative before accepting defeat. He spent his final days of humanity researching ancient texts and obscure religious practices, seeking some ritual or invocation that might sever the bonds between his family and their otherworldly patron. But every source confirmed what he had come to suspect, that contracts made with entities from beyond the veil could only be broken by the complete extinction of the bloodline that had agreed to serve them. The ritual that would complete their transformation was scheduled for the night of the summer solstice, when the barriers between worlds would be at their thinnest and the entity's power would reach its peak. The ceremony would take place in the mansion's basement, using implements and symbols that had been passed down through 7 generations of Dunham family heads. The altar that had witnessed so many dark rituals would serve one final time as the focal point for energies that would remake James and William in their brother's image. In the days leading up to the solstice, Millbrook itself seemed to respond to the approaching ceremony with signs and portents that only those with supernatural sensitivity could detect. Animals fled the area in unprecedented numbers, leaving behind empty streets that echoed with the sound of abandonment. The few residents who remained reported dreams filled with shadows that moved independently of their sources, and voices that spoke in languages that had never been written down, but somehow conveyed meaning to anyone who heard them. The coal mines that formed the foundation of the Dunham fortune had become completely impassable, their tunnels filled with a darkness so complete that even the strongest lanterns couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. Workers who had ventured too deep reported encounters with things that defied description, beings that existed in the spaces between light and shadow, and seemed to take perverse pleasure in driving human minds beyond the breaking point. The mine operations had been suspended indefinitely, but the loss of income meant nothing to Henry, whose attention was now focused entirely on preparations for the ceremony that would complete his family's transformation. James spent his final days of humanity visiting locations that held memories of happier times, trying to preserve some record of the man he had been before surrendering to forces beyond his understanding. He walked through their mother's rose garden, noting how the flowers had begun to wither despite the abundant summer rain, as if the very soil had been corrupted by proximity to the evil that was growing within the mansion's walls. He sat in the chair where their father had read them bedtime stories, remembering a time when the future had seemed bright with possibilities that didn't require the sacrifice of human decency. William used his remaining time to compose a detailed account of everything they had discovered about their family's true history. Writing with the desperate urgency of a man who knew his words might be the only warning that future generations would receive. His manuscript detailed the signs that marked families that had formed partnerships with otherworldly entities, the progression of corruption that inevitably consumed every bloodline that made such bargains, and the methods by which these ancient evils perpetuated themselves across centuries of human history. The document was hidden within the mansion's walls, sealed behind a panel that could only be opened by someone who knew precisely where to look and possessed the determination to seek truth regardless of the consequences. William hoped that someday, perhaps decades or centuries in the future, someone would discover his warnings and use them to prevent other families from following the path that had doomed the Dunhams to eternal servitude. On the night of the summer solstice, As the sun set behind clouds that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, the three brothers descended to the basement where their family's fate would be sealed forever. The chamber had been prepared, according to instructions that Henry received through channels that bypassed normal human consciousness, with symbols carved into the walls that hurt to look at directly and seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Candles made from materials that were best left unidentified provided illumination that cast shadows in directions that defied the normal laws of optics. The ritual itself unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster, each step following logically from the previous one despite the complete absence of anything resembling human logic. James and William took their positions at opposite ends of the altar, while Henry began chanting in languages that predated human civilization, his voice taking on harmonics that resonated at frequencies just below the threshold of hearing. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, becoming dense with possibilities that normal reality couldn't contain. As the ceremony progressed, the basement filled with presences that existed beyond the range of human perception, but made themselves known through changes in temperature, air pressure, and the subtle displacement of shadows that moved independently of their sources. The entity that had possessed Henry for so many years began to manifest more completely, revealing aspects of its true nature that were too alien for human minds to process without shattering completely. James felt his consciousness expanding in ways that allowed him to perceive layers of reality that normal human awareness was designed to filter out, but the knowledge came at the cost of everything that had made him recognizably human. His thoughts became shared property, accessible to minds that had never known the limitations of flesh and blood, but which demanded absolute obedience from those who served their purposes. The transformation was simultaneously liberation and enslavement, freeing him from human limitations while binding him to masters whose appetites could never be satisfied. William experienced his metamorphosis as a form of death and rebirth, his individual identity dissolving into something larger and infinitely more terrible. The scholarly mind that had sought understanding through research and rational analysis was consumed by intelligence that operated according to principles that had nothing to do with human logic or morality. What emerged from the ritual retained his memories and some vestige of his personality, but these human elements were now subordinated to purposes that served entities whose very existence was antithetical to everything that made life worth living. When the ceremony was complete, and the summer dawn broke over Millbrook with light that seemed somehow different from normal sunlight, three beings that had once been the Dunham brothers stood in the basement of their family mansion. They retained their human appearances well enough to pass casual inspection, but anyone who looked closely would notice details that suggested their true nature to those with sufficient knowledge to recognize the signs. Their eyes held depths that reflected light and patterns that were both beautiful and terrifying, and their movements possessed a fluid grace that was completely unlike normal human locomotion. The photograph that had first revealed Henry's corruption now served as a historical record of the moment when their transformation began, but its significance had evolved beyond simple documentation. The image had become a gateway of sorts, a focal point through which the entity and its servants could exert influence over events in the physical realm. Anyone who studied the photograph too closely risked exposure to forces that would gradually corrupt their own humanity, spreading the influence of the otherworldly alliance far beyond the confines of the Dunham bloodline. In the months that followed the solstice ritual, Millbrook itself began to change in ways that most residents attributed to natural cycles of growth and decay, but which were actually symptoms of supernatural influence, spreading like an infection through the community. Buildings began to show signs of premature aging, their foundations settling in patterns that created subtle geometric configurations that served purposes known only to beings that existed beyond normal space and time. Trees died and were replaced by species that shouldn't have been able to survive in Pennsylvania's climate, creating landscapes that appeared normal at first glance, but felt fundamentally wrong to anyone sensitive to such things. The brothers continued to manage their family's business interests with the same efficiency that had always characterized their operations, but their methods now incorporated elements that went far beyond conventional capitalism. Competitors found themselves plagued by misfortunes that couldn't be attributed to normal market forces, while workers who showed any sign of resistance to Dunham authority suffered accidents that served as warnings to their colleagues. The coal mines remained closed to human workers, but production somehow continued at levels that exceeded anything achieved during their operational peak. James adapted to his transformed state with something approaching relief, finding that his new existence freed him from the moral conflicts that had tormented his final days of humanity. The entity that now shared his consciousness provided clarity about his role in the larger scheme of things, eliminating the uncertainty and doubt that had plagued him when he was limited by human understanding. His abilities had expanded to include perception of events occurring across vast distances and influence over natural forces that had previously been beyond his control. William's scholarly nature persisted even after his transformation, but his research now focused on subjects that would have driven his human mind to madness. He studied the mathematics of dimensional intersection, the linguistics of languages that existed only as thought forms, and the historical patterns through which otherworldly entities had influenced human civilization since the species first developed self-awareness. His findings revealed that the Dunham family situation was part of a much larger pattern that had been unfolding for thousands of years. The entity that had claimed their bloodline was itself merely one component of a vast network of alien intelligences that had been gradually infiltrating human society since the dawn of recorded history. These beings operated according to timescales that span millennia, implementing plans that would eventually transform the entire planet into something more suitable for their purposes. The corruption of individual families was just the first step in a process that would ultimately result in the complete replacement of human civilization with something that served their otherworldly masters. Henry, as the eldest and most completely transformed of the brothers, served as the primary conduit through which the entity communicated with its broader network of allies and servants. His human identity had been almost completely subsumed by his otherworldly patron, leaving behind only enough recognizable personality to maintain the illusion of continuity for those who knew him in LAS. His previous life, when he spoke now, it was with the authority of something that had existed since before the first stars began to burn, offering perspectives on time and causality that no human mind could fully comprehend. As autumn returned to Millbrook with colors that seemed somehow more vivid than natural pigments should allow, the brothers received word that other families similar to theirs were beginning to manifest more openly throughout the region. The network of corruption that had been spreading invisibly for generations was entering a new phase of development, one that would bring it into direct conflict with human institutions that still maintained some vestige of independence from otherworldly influence. The photograph that had started their journey into darkness had been reproduced and distributed to other servant families, serving as both identification and invitation to those who possessed the knowledge necessary to interpret its hidden meanings. Each copy retained some portion of the original's power to reveal truth and corrupt viewers, spreading the influence of the otherworldly alliance far beyond the boundaries of any single community or bloodline. Churches began reporting unexplained phenomena during services, with shadows moving independently of their sources and voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. Government officials found themselves making decisions that served purposes they couldn't quite remember agreeing to, while business leaders implemented policies that advanced agendas they didn't fully understand. The transformation was accelerating, moving from the gradual corruption of individual families to the systematic subversion of entire social institutions. James found himself assigned to oversee operations in neighboring communities, spreading the influence of their otherworldly patrons through carefully orchestrated business dealings and social interactions. His human appearance and remaining vestiges of recognizable personality made him an ideal ambassador for entities that needed to operate within human society while their larger plans reached fruition. The work was both satisfying and disturbing, combining the intellectual challenge of complex negotiations with the knowledge that success meant the eventual doom of everyone he encountered. William's research revealed that the acceleration of their activities was tied to astronomical events that occurred only once every few thousand years. Celestial alignments that would temporarily weaken the barriers between dimensions and allow for unprecedented levels of otherworldly intervention in human affairs. The window of opportunity would remain open for only a few decades, making it crucial that their network of servants establish sufficient control over human institutions to ensure that the transformation could continue even after cosmic conditions returned to normal. The coal mines that had funded their family's rise to power had become something far more significant than simple extraction operations, serving as focal points for energies that existed in dimensions parallel to Ra. Normal space-time. The darkness that had claimed the tunnels was actually a form of dimensional overlap, creating spaces where beings from beyond the veil could manifest more easily and exert direct influence over events in the physical realm. Similar installations were being established by other servant families throughout the region, creating a network of otherworldly strongholds that would serve as beachheads for the coming transformation. As winter approached with weather patterns that defied meteorological prediction, bringing snow that fell in geometric configurations, and winds that carried voices and languages that had never been spoken by human throats, the brothers received their most significant assignment yet. They were to coordinate with servant families across the eastern seaboard in preparing for the arrival of entities whose power exceeded anything that had previously been allowed to manifest on Earth. The photograph that had revealed their true nature now occupied a place of honor in a specially constructed chamber beneath the mansion. Surrounded by artifacts and implements that had been collected from bloodlines that had served the otherworldly alliance for even longer than the Dunhams, the image had evolved beyond simple documentation to become a living record of the transformation that was spreading through human society, its details changing in real time to reflect events occurring across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Visitors to the chamber, on the rare occasions when such visits were permitted, reported that the photograph subjects appeared to move and speak, offering glimpses of realities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. The fingers wrapped around Henry's throat had multiplied and extended, creating complex patterns that served as maps of dimensional intersections where the otherworldly alliance maintained permanent footholds in the physical realm. The brothers themselves had become something beyond human understanding. Retaining enough of their original personalities to function within the society they were systematically subverting while serving masters whose purposes transcended anything that purely human intelligence could conceive. They were simultaneously the children of Margaret and Jonathan Dunham, and the servants of entities that had been ancient when the first humans developed language. Existing in a state that was neither fully human nor entirely alien but something altogether new and unprecedented. The story of the Dunham brothers serves as both warning and prophecy, illustrating the gradual process by which human bloodlines are corrupted and transformed to serve purposes that most people would consider absolutely evil if they possessed sufficient understanding to recognize them. The photograph that captured their moment of revelation remains as evidence of realities that exist just beyond the threshold of normal perception, waiting for those with sufficient knowledge and courage to look closely enough to see the truth that hides in plain sight. But for those who lived in Millbrook during that fateful year of 1888, the transformation of the Dunham brothers was just the beginning of changes that would ultimately consume their entire community and spread like a contagion to every corner of human civilization. The otherworldly alliance that had claimed them was patient beyond human comprehension, but relentless in its pursuit of goals that could only be achieved through the systematic corruption of everything that made humanity worth preserving. The photograph endures, waiting in its climate-controlled environment for researchers who will eventually discover details that 1888 technology couldn't reveal. Truths about the nature of reality that will challenge everything that modern science believes about the universe and humanity's place within it. When that day comes, the warning left by William Dunham's hidden manuscript may be the only thing standing between civilization and a transformation that will make the fate of 3 brothers in Pennsylvania seem like a minor prelude to horrors that defy imagination. Until then, the image serves as a reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, and that the most dangerous threats to human survival may come not from external enemies, but from the corruption that grows within families, communities, and institutions that appear perfectly normal to casual observation. The fingers wrapped around Henry Dunham's throat in that long-ago photograph are still there, still tightening their grip, still serving masters whose patience exceeds human understanding, and whose ultimate victory may already be inevitable. The years following the brothers' transformation brought changes to Pennsylvania that historians would later struggle to explain through conventional means. Entire communities began to disappear from census records, not through catastrophic events or mass migrations, but through a gradual process of abandonment that left behind empty towns where the buildings remained perfectly preserved, but devoid of human habitation. These ghost settlements became way stations for entities that needed physical anchor points in the material realm, places where the laws of physics grew negotiable and time itself became fluid. Marcus Whitfield, the photographer who had inadvertently captured the first evidence of the Dunham family's corruption, had fled to New York City in the desperate hope that distance and urban anonymity might protect him from the consequences of his supernatural encounter. But the entity that possessed Henry Dunham had marked him during their brief interaction, leaving invisible traces that allowed it to track his movements across any distance. Whitfield's subsequent photographs, no matter what subjects he chose or what techniques he employed, began to reveal similar anomalies to those he had captured in the Dunham family portrait. The curse spread through his work like a contagion, each new image carrying fragments of otherworldly influence that gradually corrupted everyone who viewed them. Gallery owners who displayed his photographs reported increased incidents of accidents and unexplained illnesses among their patrons, while art critics who wrote about his work found their prose taking on qualities that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the primitive fears that lurked in the deepest recesses of human consciousness. Whitfield himself began to change in ways that paralleled the Dunham brothers' transformation, though his corruption followed a different trajectory that reflected his role as an unwilling conduit rather than a willing servant. His perception expanded to include aspects of reality that human eyes weren't designed to process, allowing him to see the network of otherworldly influence that was spreading through American society like a vast web of corruption and control. The knowledge drove him to the edge of madness, but it also provided him with a unique understanding of the forces that were reshaping his world. In his final months of recognizable humanity, Whitfield created a series of photographs that served as both documentary evidence and desperate warning about the supernatural invasion that was unfolding beneath the surface of normal life. These images captured moments when the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough to reveal the true nature of beings that most people mistook for their neighbors, friends, and family members. Politicians whose eyes reflected depths that extended far beyond normal human consciousness, business leaders whose shadows moved independently of their physical forms, and religious figures whose sermons carried harmonics that resonated at frequencies designed to reprogram human behavior rather than inspire spiritual growth. The photographs were distributed through underground networks of individuals who had begun to recognize the signs of otherworldly corruption, but lacked the resources or knowledge necessary to mount effective resistance. These amateur investigators represented humanity's last hope for understanding the scope of the threat they faced, but their efforts were hampered by the very nature of the entities they sought to expose. The Otherworldly Alliance operated according to principles that transcended human logic, making it virtually impossible for purely human intelligence to predict their strategies or counter their moves. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, a professor of anthropology at Harvard University, became one of the few academics to take Whitfield's warnings seriously after her own research into unexplained population disappearances led her to conclusions that her colleagues dismissed as professional suicide. Her investigation into the abandoned communities of Pennsylvania revealed patterns that suggested systematic rather than random abandonment, with demographic data indicating that entire bloodlines had simply vanished from public records without leaving behind any trace of their ultimate destination. Crane's fieldwork in the affected regions exposed her to evidence that challenged everything she thought she knew about the relationship between human society and the forces that shaped historical development. Archaeological excavations in areas where communities had disappeared revealed artifacts that predated known human occupation by thousands of years. Objects crafted from materials that didn't exist in nature and inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The most disturbing discovery came when Crane's team uncovered what appeared to be a vast underground complex beneath the site where Millbrook had once stood. Chambers carved from living rock in patterns that defied conventional geometry, and filled with machinery whose purpose could only be guessed at by minds still bound by human limitations. The installation appeared to have been operational for centuries, drawing power from sources that existed beyond the electromagnetic spectrum and broadcasting signals that influenced human behavior across distances that should have been impossible to achieve with any known dawn. technology. Crane's attempts to publish her findings were met with resistance from academic institutions that had apparently been infiltrated by the same otherworldly influence she was trying to expose. Research grants were withdrawn, colleagues distanced themselves from her work, and eventually she found herself blacklisted from the scholarly community that had once respected her contributions to anthropological knowledge. But rather than abandoning her investigation, Crane went underground, continuing her research through private funding and clandestine networks that operated outside the control of corrupting institutions. Her work eventually brought her into contact with other researchers who had encountered similar evidence of supernatural interference in human affairs. Forming a loose confederation of academics, investigators, and ordinary citizens who shared a common understanding of the threat that conventional society refused to acknowledge. This informal resistance movement operated in the shadows of normal life, gathering intelligence about otherworldly activities while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with entities whose power exceeded anything that purely human resources could hope to challenge. The network's investigations revealed that the Dunham family's transformation was just one example of a pattern that had been repeating throughout American history since the earliest days of colonial settlement. Wealthy and influential families in every major city showed signs of otherworldly corruption, their rise to power facilitated by alliances that provided supernatural advantages in exchange for services that gradually consumed their humanity. These bloodlines served as focal points for an invasion that was cultural and spiritual rather than military, transforming human civilization from within while maintaining the appearance of normal historical development. Government records that had been sealed or classified revealed additional evidence of supernatural interference in political and economic affairs, with policy decisions that seemed to serve no rational human interest, but which advanced agendas that could only be understood from perspectives that transcended normal space and time. Wars were fought to establish dimensional anchor points, immigration patterns were manipulated to bring together bloodlines that carried specific genetic markers, and technological development was guided along paths that would eventually produce tools suitable for otherworldly purposes. The resistance movement's most significant breakthrough came when they gained access to William Dunham's hidden manuscript, which had remained concealed within the walls of the abandoned family mansion for nearly 3 decades. The document provided detailed information about the methods by which otherworldly entities identified and corrupted human bloodlines, as well as practical techniques for recognizing the signs of supernatural influence before it reached irreversible stages. William's writings revealed that the entities behind the invasion possessed intelligence that operated according to principles completely alien to human thought, but they were not invincible or beyond the reach of countermeasures developed by sufficiently determined resistance. The key lay in understanding that the otherworldly alliance depended on willing human cooperation to maintain their foothold in the material realm, making it theoretically possible to disrupt their operations by severing the connections between corrupted bloodlines and their supernatural patrons. The manuscript also contained detailed instructions for rituals that could provide protection against otherworldly influence. Though these procedures required materials and knowledge that were difficult to obtain without attracting unwanted attention from entities that monitored such activities, the resistance movement began working to establish secure supply lines for these specialized resources while training selected members in craft the techniques necessary to perform protective ceremonies without alerting their supernatural enemies to the threat of organized opposition. Dr. Crane's team developed methods for identifying corrupted individuals and institutions through careful observation of behavioral patterns and physical anomalies that became apparent to trained observers. Eyes that reflected light in patterns that defied normal optical properties, movements that suggested joint flexibility beyond human anatomical limits, and speech patterns that incorporated harmonics at frequencies that induced subtle changes in listener brain chemistry. These signs could be detected by people who knew what to look for, but they remained invisible to ordinary perception that had been conditioned to filter out information that challenged conventional understanding of reality. The resistance movement's activities eventually attracted the attention of the Otherworldly Alliance, which responded with a campaign of subtle persecution designed to discredit and isolate the investigators without creating martyrs that might inspire others to take up their cause. Careers were destroyed through seemingly natural sequences of professional misfortune. Personal relationships were sabotaged by manipulation of emotional states. And physical health was undermined through exposure to environmental factors that produced symptoms mimicking natural illness. Several prominent researchers died under circumstances that appeared to be accidents or natural causes, but which showed patterns consistent with otherworldly assassination techniques. Dr. Crane herself survived multiple attempts on her life, only through the protection offered by rituals derived from William Dunham's manuscript. Though the constant stress of living under supernatural siege took a toll on her physical and mental health that conventional medicine was powerless to address. The resistance movement's investigation into the current status of the Dunham brothers revealed that their transformation had progressed far beyond the initial stages documented in William's manuscript. Henry had become something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, his human appearance maintained only as a convenience for interactions that required recognizable form. James and William had been assigned to oversee operations in different regions of the country, spreading the otherworldly alliance's influence through networks of corrupted businesses, religious organizations, and government agencies. Attempts to locate and confront the transformed brothers directly proved futile, as they possessed abilities that allowed them to perceive and counter conventional investigative techniques with ease. Their human identities had become masks that could be assumed or discarded as circumstances required, while their true selves existed in states that transcended normal concepts of individual identity and HRL. Physical location. The photograph that had first revealed Henry's corruption had become the centerpiece of a shrine that served as a focal point for otherworldly energies throughout the eastern seaboard. Pilgrims who had been selected by the Alliance would make journeys to view the image, returning to their communities with enhanced abilities to influence and corrupt those around them. The photograph itself had evolved into something that was part historical document and part living entity, its surface reflecting not just light but also thoughts, emotions, and memories of everyone who looked upon it. Restoration experts who attempted to examine the image using modern technology discovered that it responded to their efforts by revealing additional details that hadn't been visible to previous viewers, as if the photograph was tailoring its revelations to match the technological capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities of each new observer. X-ray analysis revealed layers of imagery that extended far below the surface emulsion, showing scenes of rituals and ceremonies that had occurred in dimensions parallel to normal space-time. Spectroscopic analysis of the photograph's chemical composition revealed elements that didn't exist in the standard periodic table, suggesting that the image had been created using materials that originated from beyond the boundaries of normal physical reality. These exotic substances appeared to be unstable under normal conditions, but were somehow maintained in coherent form by the same forces that allowed the photograph to continue revealing new information decades after its creation. The resistance movement's final major discovery came when they realized that the otherworldly alliance's invasion was approaching a crucial transition phase that would determine whether humanity retained any capacity for independent existence or was completely absorbed into a collective consciousness that served alien purposes. The timeline for this transformation was tied to astronomical events that occurred only once every few millennia, creating a narrow window of opportunity during which effective resistance might still be possible. The battle for humanity's future would be fought not with conventional weapons, but through techniques that most people would dismiss as superstition or fantasy, requiring defenders who were willing to risk their sanity and souls in confrontations with entities whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which human civilization was built. The photograph of the three Dunham brothers from 1888 had become both symbol and weapon in this struggle, representing the moment when the otherworldly alliance first revealed itself openly, while serving as a focal point for energies that would ultimately determine the fate of every human being on Earth. Time was running out, and the choices made by a few dozen resistance fighters operating in the shadows of normal society would determine whether future generations would remember humanity as Peen. It once existed, or as something altogether different, that wore human faces while serving masters whose purposes transcended everything that had once made life worth living.